Good afternoon. I'm Indrani Bagchi, CEO of the Ananta Center, and welcome to another fireside chat at the Raisina Dialogue 2022. I have with me Prime Minister Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia, and today we will talk about India Australia Connect, or rather Delhi Canberra Connect, and look at the way India and Australia have evolved their bilateral relationship in this century. Time was when, and I remember this, time was when we would not have been able to say this. I think for many years, India and Australia were on different parts of the spectrum on how we viewed each other and how we viewed the world. Um, Today, that no longer exists. And I think India certainly counts Australia as one of its closest partners, not just in the Indo Pacific, but across the world. And who better to talk about it than Prime Minister Tony Abbott, who did a lot of the heavy lifting when he was Prime Minister of Australia. Welcome, Prime Minister, and welcome to Raisina 2022. Could you give us a sense of how the bilateral relationship has evolved in the last, say, what, 2 decades?
Indrani, thank you very much indeed for having me. And if I may, let me begin with a personal story.
Yes.
Back in 1981, I was lucky enough to be picked to go to England as a Rhodes Scholar to study at Oxford. I had 3 months to kill between finishing my College of Law in Sydney and beginning in Oxford. And unlike most of my contemporaries who would have got a Eurail pass for 3 months, I didn't want to fly over almost 1 billion people without stopping to pay my respects. So I spent 3 months here in India back in 1981. I went to Mumbai, Ahmedabad, Rajasthan, Delhi, Kashmir, and then I spent the best part of 2 months in Bihar province, not in Patna and the other large cities, but in small cities like Hazaribagh, Daltonganj, Bokaro Steel City. I spent a lot of time in the company of Australian Jesuit missionaries and their Indian colleagues. That gave me a real sense of India, a love for India, and a fascination with this country's potential. Even then, it was obvious to me that India was going to shake the world once it decided to take a bigger place on the world stage. And frankly, as an exemplary democracy, as the world's largest democracy, India should take a bigger place on the world stage. Thank God, under Prime Minister Modi, that's exactly what's happening. And I'm pleased to have played perhaps a small part in encouraging India and certainly in encouraging Australia to take a much greater interest in a country with which we should always have had a strong partnership. I mean, let's face it, we're both democracies, we're both under the rule of law, we have to a great extent the English language in common, and elements of shared history, going right back to the days when the horses of the Indian Army were known as whalers because they came from Australia.
That's right. That's right. Well, Prime Minister, if you look at India-Australia relations today, and we've just signed a free trade agreement, again, something that I think both sides have struggled with for many years. What, in your view, are the prospects? If you look forward, what are the areas, what are maybe the 3 key areas that you can think of that we can look forward to when the 2 countries are?
Okay, well, just on the free trade deal, you're right, it had languished for a decade. It came briefly into incandescent heat when Prime Minister Modi came to Australia back in 2014, and he and I were determined to get the deal done as quickly as we could. It then languished for a while while India was dallying with the regional comprehensive economic partnership. And once Scott Morrison became Prime Minister, and once India decided to ditch the RCEP, as I think they rightly did, then of course the India-Australia relationship came back into focus, and I was delighted to be able to play a part in that myself. But all credit to Prime Ministers Modi and Morrison. In the end, nothing of this substance happens without prime ministerial drive. All credit to Ministers Goyal and Tian for their extraordinarily diligent and detailed work. The foundation of the India-Australia economic relationship is first the rule of law we both share. Second, the economic complementarity that we both have. And third, the incredibly vigorous and dynamic Indian diaspora that exists in Australia. We're talking here about almost 1 million very creative people. Let's face it, they came to Australia from India because they were determined to have the best possible life for themselves, and they thought they would find, as they invariably have, a welcoming and supportive home in Australia. Now they want to give back to Australia, but they haven't forgotten India, and it's the Australians with Indian connections and the Indians with Australian connections who are going to make this thing work. It's not going to be driven by government. It's going to be driven by individuals and by businesses who see the opportunity to do well for everyone's benefit, and that's what's going to make it happen. There's also, if I may say so, if you like, a global moment here. So much of the contemporary economy has had China at the heart of supply chains. For all sorts of reasons, many countries now want to minimise their China dependency. No country is better placed than India to substitute for China in those supply chains, given its very sophisticated manufacturing capacity and its ability to produce at scale for a very good price and at very high quality. So I think this is quite a moment for India, and I suspect that the India-Australia deal will be the forerunner for a number of other deals, perhaps the UK deal, first cab off the rank. Right. And an economy which, for several decades post-independence, was a bit aloof from the global system under doctrines of self-sufficiency, understandable, but in the end I suspect somewhat counterproductive, is now really going to throw itself into the wider world and make the most of its opportunities.
You mentioned China, and it's not just supply chains. We are looking at a very different China. We're looking at an aggressive China. We like to call China an expansionist power. You have had trouble with China recently. We continue to have trouble with China. How would you characterize China in the Indo-Pacific today, or China as it is, the power that it is today, and what it means for countries like India and Australia?
Look, let's give credit where it's due initially. There's no doubt that the economic rise of China wasn't just good for the 500 million or so Chinese who moved from the third world to the middle class in scarcely a generation. It's also been good for the wider world, and certainly in Australia we were particularly able to take advantage of it and indeed help to fuel it with coal, with iron ore, with gas, etc. What's happened though is that while countries like Australia were indulging in perhaps a bit of wishful thinking that as China became more economically liberal, it might also become more politically liberal. I think the Chinese Communist leadership never intended political liberalisation. For them, market liberalisation was, if you like, a short-term device to strengthen China, as opposed to a long-term shift towards a more free and decent country and system. So the period of hiding their strength and biding their time is well and truly over. China is well and truly on the march, internally and externally. We all have to realise that the China we thought we were dealing with 5 or 10 years back is not the China we actually are dealing with. China is determined to be the world's top country. It's determined to take back Taiwan, and it sees all of its neighbours essentially as tributary states. We've had first-hand experience of this in Australia, first with the weaponisation of trade by China against us. Something like $20 billion worth of Australian exports have been subjected to capricious bans and boycotts and hold-ups. And about 18 months ago, they formally served upon us 14 demands, if you like, essentially that we accepted all Chinese investment, we accepted all Chinese students, we ceased all criticism of China, and we ended our alliance with the United States, all completely unacceptable for a free, independent and sovereign country. To our credit, we have politely but firmly stood up to China, and in its own different but equally firm way, India is likewise standing up to China.
Yes, and that brings the two countries together in the Quad, and not just perhaps not just standing up to China, but looking towards building a different kind of world. And how do you see that?
Well, I'm very conscious of the fact that while India has thoroughly assimilated, indeed embraced, concepts that it first became familiar with from Britain, even if Britain didn't always practice them that well here in India, democracy, the rule of law, universal human rights, etc. Because of the history, India could well have decided to stand aloof from countries such as Australia. To its great credit, this hasn't been the case, particularly in recent years under Prime Minister Modi. I want to do everything I personally can to ensure that India is family to us in every sense of the word. And I'm confident that over time, India isn't just going to be part of something like the Quad. It will be the leader, if you like, of the Quad. For the last 70-odd years, in countries like Australia, we've been accustomed to refer to America as the leader of the free world. Now, all credit to America. Whatever faults America has and whatever mistakes America has made, and there have been a few in terms of its relations with India, I've got to say, it's hard to doubt America's goodwill, and you've got to accept, I think, the extraordinary amount of blood and treasure that America has invested over the years in an essentially idealistic attempt to make the world better and safer for democracy. But if there is to be a leader of the free world in 50 or 100 years' time, frankly, it's much more likely to be India than the United States. Indeed, if there is to be a free world in 50 or 100 years' time, it'll be because India has been a driving, if not the driving force in that. So I've always felt very comfortable here in India. Even back in 1981 when I was here as a 23-year-old, it was an exotic place, but not a strange place. And I'm keen to do what I can, not just to boost the Australia-India relationship, but to encourage India to take its rightful place as a leader in the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prime Minister. One last question. Scott Morrison likes to cook samosas.
Uh-huh.
What do you do?
Well, I'd rather eat them than cook them, okay? It's funny. Back in 1981, I was travelling third class, so to speak, as you do in your backpacker days. And my constitution wasn't always strong enough to cope with some of the
Spices.
local conditions. My first night in England, I was looking for a feed with some of my mates, and they suggested the local Indian restaurant. I was a bit looking for a break, frankly, but I went, and ever since I've been a complete addict of Indian cuisine.
Well, there you go. Thank you so much, Prime Minister. It was lovely talking to you.
Thanks, Indrani.
Thank you very much.